language and culture, they play a pretty important role when it comes down to international business because at the end of the day, a huge amount of business really deals a lot with how you get along with somebody. Can you trust the person you're dealing with to follow through on what you've agreed to in the process? So really, when we start talking about language and culture, it does play a role in the aspect of creating long-term relationships as you go through. Yeah, there's some new research coming out where it talks really about the aspect of cognitive psychology. There's a connection between language and thinking. When you start looking at different cultures, when it comes down to how does the brain structure go through and form words as you go through? How is some of the aspects of, let's say, for instance, Germans? Germans have a huge history as a nation of producing really good engineering. We have other countries, they have a huge tradition of having all kinds of traditions when it comes down to the actual culture, the celebrations, and the personalities when it comes down to it. You have other cultures where they're really big on community thinking. We're going to dive into that because a lot of this stuff when it talks about business really does hinge as to what is the cultural norm in the country. When you go to some other countries, the senior person should always talk first. They have a certain specific order in the process of who should be talking in the process. Americans, a lot of us, at the lowest level worker feel free perfectly to talk candidly to the CEO of the corporation, which simply wouldn't happen in other types of cultures when it comes down to it. And then do words help shape the person's experience in the way that they communicate? Do the words go through and help the brain structure? There's some new research out there. I encourage you to go out and look at it because it might help you understand different kinds of cultures. A lot of things in the United States are very different. If you take the class business communications, I go through and talk about the aspect of some of the nonverbal communications, such as steepling. In America, we view steepling as a matter of raw arrogance. If you use the same type of body language down in South America, it is not viewed as arrogance, it's viewed as knowing your topic inside and out. When you have a closed aspect versus an open aspect, all these things are part of culture and how people go and they respond to the different kinds of experiences as you go through. Language and culture in the translation, sometimes you say something and it comes across differently. I have a friend of mine, Jeannie Nishimi, and she once told me, she says, David, I came to this country when I was 14 from Japan, and a lot of your puns and jokes don't mean anything to me. So feel free to stop giving to me because I'll never laugh at them because I always translate what you say into Japanese back in my head. And I'm wired that way. I'm probably never going to change. So knock off the puns. That is the conversation. It hurt my feelings, except at least they knew I should never laugh because some of them were pretty funny. So sometimes you sit down and you go through, you look and you listen, and sometimes you see that you're not connecting on a whole different aspect of it. Culture really is the sum of the beliefs, rules, techniques, institutions, and artifacts that characterize human populations. We're going to be talking about it in an international sense, but even in a country like the United States, we're huge physically and have an enormous population compared to an awful lot of other countries, maybe not as big population-wise as countries like China or India, but still we're expansive. But even in a country where generally you have English being the predominant language from coast to coast, you have huge differences in the culture. The California culture is very, very different from the Midwest culture, and it's very, very different from the Southern culture. If I went down to Georgia, and as fast as I talk, I've been there a couple times, and everybody wants me to talk slower because they don't understand because I talk too fast. Yes, it's true. I've been corrected numerous times. Sometimes you make adjustments as to what you are to sit down there and communicate well in another culture, even something as simple as that, even though you're in theory speaking the same language. Ethnocentricity is a belief that your own culture is superior to other cultures. Well, maybe not, because you're going to believe that no matter what, because that's how you were raised, and you're raised in the process you should go through. And talk about personalities, there really is a development from two different sources. Okay, according to the Minnesota Twin Study, and I recommend you go check it out. They've done a huge series of studies with over 100 twins, identical twins, separated at birth, and they went back and they checked them out later on and they did tests on them to see if their values were the same. They found that the values, even though one may be raised over here and one raised hundreds, even thousands of miles apart, when they bring them back together, a lot of them have the same values, okay? And they came up with a number of 50 to 2/3 or 67% of the values are the same. So about 50 to 67% of our personalities is actually genetically derived. The rest of it really comes from the environment that we're raised in or the culture. If you want to check this out, feel free to check it out directly on the Minnesota Twin Study or my book, Backboneology, Tough Decisions at Work. So that being said, a lot comes from environmental imprinting, and part of it is the culture. The culture is not just the people walking down the street and the different social mores. It comes from our textbooks, it comes from our teachers, it comes from, especially more than anything else, our family, especially our parents. The personal values, they come from society, and we carry those things pretty much by the time you're 10 years old. You're going to be carrying about 90% of your lifetime values for your entire life. And then when you hit 120, you carry 100% of those, almost for sure, anywhere from the music you like to the different aspects of different tastes that you have in colors, decorating aspects of it, different favorite things that you have. You'll probably carry those the rest of your life unless you have a significant emotional event as you go through. When you go through a country like China, there's actually 302 living languages and dialects in China, one country. And on top of that, even if you want to sit down and say, well, some of those are teeny tiny differences, variances, well, there's actually 10 different major languages in China. There's tended to be Mandarin Chinese being the trade language, but the fact there's 10 major languages in one nation. You can't tell me that's not confusing and difficult, even within one nation, let alone trading across overseas as you go through in the process. So you always pay attention as the aspect of culture. It's learned, and we're not born with a culture that's imprinted on us in the environment. A lot of parts of the aspect of the culture are interrelated. Culture shared, patterned, constructed through social interaction. It really is a powerful tool in the aspect of diversity. I approach diversity very different than a lot of different social scientists when it comes down to it. I realize you're going after political correctness from a human aspect and from a business aspect, because this is a business class, it's called international business. You need to pay attention to diversity in the aspect of, can it open new markets in the process as you go through? If you're going to sit down and make a serious effort from the United States to go into the Middle East, shouldn't you sit down and look at your staffing and see if you have anybody that has skill sets or was raised in a Middle Eastern culture? How about an Asian culture? Suppose you want to crack India. Should you pay attention to your staffing? Do you have anybody that has a history of working in the Indian culture, because of the fact that you may say something or they may have a better insight into how people are thinking in that culture? Diversity is a big, powerful tool when it comes down to international business as you go through. Business managers, they have to learn how to live, work, meet business goals with other cultures. When you take a business card, do you follow the old Asian custom of accepting it with two hands and tucking it in your shirt pocket next to your heart? Or do you sit down and just fling it across the counter as you go through and leave it over there in the process, like the Americans do in the process? So you learn different aspects of different things when it comes down to things, including like Worf here from Star Trek, holding his pinky up as he sips a cup of hot tea, and being the Klingon, as you know, if you pay attention to Star Trek, you know that's an important part of his culture to go through. So culture really is about the things that are imprinted around us, but there's always a thing called ethnocentricity, where we tend to view that our culture as, of course, the very best in the entire world. Okay, and it doesn't matter who you are, what part of the world you're coming from, you're going to think that. Always keep in mind that the person you're talking to thinks the same thing about their culture. Culture is learned. International has to understand the culture they intend to survive and thrive in. Take care.